I'm recording my homily for the 6th Sunday of Easter in 2019. This weekend was Memorial Day, and I was just remembering back a couple years ago, I decided to go to Washington, D.C., and I wasn't really paying attention. When I travel, I generally don't make lots of plans. I'll go somewhere and then kind of figure it out when I'm there. And there was this one day I was like, I really want to go to the Arlington National Cemetery. And very famous cemetery where we keep, where the remains are of lots of our soldiers who given their lives in battle, and wanted to go there. And so I decided to go there. I wasn't planning on doing that originally. And I get down there and it's like, wow, why are there so many people here? Well, I went down on Memorial Day. So it was actually a really great experience. Actually, the president was there, and they had a big ceremony there at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And it was quite an experience, and I bring that up partially to talk about the very nature of decisions that we all make and the consequences that those decisions have. So, for example, in the Civil War, 620,000 soldiers died in that war. 620,000 soldiers died. That's about the same amount of soldiers that have died in all the other wars combined. All of them. It's an astounding number of soldiers. Why did so many die? Why did so many have to die? Well, the decision came down to probably no more than 50 people. Politicians who came to the decision that we're going to cause this war, we're going to separate. And so because of the decision of those 50 people, or however many there were, 620,000 soldiers were going to die. And so there's consequences to our decision, right? Have you ever been next to a lake that's just absolutely calm, perfectly just mirrored calm, and you throw a pebble and you can watch the ripples just keep going and going and going. And if there was a point where you said, okay, I'm going to stop it, you can't. You can't stop them once they keep going. And so it's like that with our decisions, the consequences. Whether we're talking about a really good decision or a really bad decision, there's going to be a ripple effect of that for good or for bad. And so these, however many politicians, when they made their decision, that ripple effect affected 620,000 people. That was 2%. 2% of the entire population of the United States died in the Civil War. Today, that would be, I haven't done the math. 2% would be like, I don't know, it'd be a lot. What's 2% of like 700 million? 10, I don't know. I'll do the math later. It's a lot of people, right? And so a few people make a decision that affects so many. So the consequences of our decisions. So when we sin, the ripple effect is far more than we can possibly imagine, right? And those ripple effects go into time. They go into the future, right? Because we often pass down to each other the wounds from our sins. So, talking a little bit about consequences. Now, every single one of those soldiers also made a decision. Now, I realize that sometimes people aren't always completely free in whether they choose to enter a war or not. But they made a decision where they knew they were going to have to sacrifice their life for the sake of something greater than themselves. There is something very noble about that. Hopefully for a noble cause, right? When people say, I'm going to fight for something that's good and holy. Now in the Catholic Church, we honor the saints, we honor the martyrs. These were people who didn't go out and necessarily engage in war and kill, but they gave of their lives for the sake of something far more beautiful than maybe the world realized at that moment. And so they're willing to sacrifice their life. Okay? And so then the consequences of their decision to repair the damage done, right? So when one person makes a bad decision, 620,000 will have to now make a good decision to repair the damage done. It's actually kind of frightful when you think about it. Have you ever said something really bad and then said something really nasty to somebody or something negative or gossiped about them? How long it took to repair the damage done? I had a wedding on Saturday and was talking a little bit about something kind of similar to this, where I was talking about how, in the wedding, the couple makes 3 promises, right? And so they promise to each other with God as the witness, and the God is the one blessing them, right? I guess the priest is the witness, the God is the one blessing them. But they make 3 promises, and the answer to each one of those promises is yes. And if one of them includes a no, then we got a problem. We have to stop the wedding and say, well, we can't continue until you change your answer, right? I mean, that's never happened for me, but obviously we have to have a yes in order for us to have the marriage, right? But for every yes, there's always a whole bunch of other no's that have to go with it. So for example, at the wedding, the man turns to his future wife and says, yes, I will be faithful to you till death do us part, right? Well, in that moment, he has to say no to every single other woman in the world. Now, perhaps on that day, that's not quite that difficult, but there's going to be other days where there may be temptations, and he's going to need to say no in order to keep the yes. And if one of those no's falters and becomes a yes, then that yes with his wife begins to falter and die or be wounded. Hence the consequences, right? And so with every yes for something good, there has to be like 1,000 no's, which is not a bad thing, but I think it's good for us to keep that in mind. And every person who hears the gospel and responds to it wants the yes. We need to be mindful of all the no's as well. We have to be able to say those no's. The other day, somebody came up to me and was talking to me about some of the things that are in the news, and I think a lot of Catholics get a little confused by some of this, or a lot of people get confused by it, so I wanted to bring it up. But it has to do with consequences of our decisions. And so we have a couple states in the United States now that are essentially banning abortions. And they're passing laws that restrict the legality of abortions more and more. And there's more and more people, because of this, screaming out and panicking and saying, well, what about, because they're afraid that there's opportunities for compassion that are now going to be restricted or made illegal. In their mind, abortion being the path of compassion, okay? Now, what are some of those circumstances that they're saying over and over and over in the press? Well, they're talking about the necessity to legalize, to keep legal, abortions for girls, for women who've been victims of rape or incest. I believe even our president has been coming out and saying that. And so I want to talk about that. And so the first really, really bad decision that happened was by the perpetrator who chose to perpetrate, who chose to harm this young girl or young woman with rape or incest. And so you now have the consequences of that horrible decision, which then at some point, if the young girl or woman were to become pregnant, forces her to make a decision with regards to that pregnancy. Now, in our mindset, our human mindset, I understand, and it makes sense to me how people would think that telling a woman in that situation she has to keep her child could emotionally be very damaging to her, because it's like we're telling her that she has to keep evidence for the rest of her life of what had happened. It's going to be in front of her in this child. And so I think our human nature is that would be cold-blooded to do that. Or even to ask her to carry that baby to term and adopt the baby out. It would be unreasonable. She did nothing wrong, right? They actually did a study on this. I don't remember the year they did it, but it wasn't that long ago. They did a study, and they basically split the group of women up into 2 groups in the study. And you had women who had been victims of rape or incest, and they had abortions because of, so they became pregnant, they had an abortion. And then you had another group of women who were also victims of rape and incest, but they chose to keep the child. And they actually found that by and large, the women who kept the child did far better emotionally with recuperating, with healing, than the women who had an abortion. Does that make sense? If that's true, does that make sense? I mean, you think about it. You have a woman who's gone through something so horrible, so despicable, right? But after the abortion, she's all alone. There's nothing that could help her in that kind of mysterious, life-giving way, help her to see innocence and beauty and purity. Whereas the mothers who kept their children, you know, in our cold-hearted, rational way, we think that she would see in this child the horrible thing that happened, but that's not reality with motherhood. That's not reality with women. They're not wired that way. At least that's my understanding, right? I'm an outsider on this one. But what they actually found was in the child, they found redemption. They found an opportunity to replace what had happened with something beautiful and innocent. Now, did that always happen? Did all the women make that transition? No. But they found it, by and large, was very healing. Not to even mention the fact that they had chosen life, they had chosen love, when somebody else, looking upon them, in some ways chose death and darkness and evil. There is such incredible power in that redemption and the choice that woman makes. Now, and this example I'm going to use is kind of a dumb example. It's obviously not quite this drastic. When I was growing up, I remember this one particular day. So my parents were fighting, right? And they were fighting because, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, they were fighting because of financial issues. They were having trouble paying the bills, and they were really struggling. And so this one day it kind of blew up into an argument. And it got very heated. And so there reached a point where my mom decided that she was gonna leave the house, not like separate the marriage, but just leave for a couple hours, right? Just to kind of calm down. Well, I was pretty young at the time, and so I remember her just kind of scooping me up and taking me as we left the house. And I'm like, Mom, I don't have shoes on. And she's like, you'll be okay. Don't worry about it, right? So where does she take me? She takes me to the park. And she sits there while I play in the playground. I'm just a little kid, right? Now, I was doing nothing other than being a kid. But I can imagine to my mom in that moment, and all the things that can go through the mind with parents who've gone through something like this, that when they look upon their children, it brings them back to something that's pure, innocent, beautiful, and something that needs their love. And so then it pulls them out and it pulls them back to that which is more important. And so after spending some time in the playground, we went right back home. And my parents continued on, and they healed, and they said they were sorry, and life continued on in the family. I can't tell you how many times as a priest I've talked to couples where they said, you know, Father, I was at a point where the only thing that kept us together were the kids. I've heard that so many times. Maybe that's all God needs sometimes, is that innocence and beauty to come into the world and pull us back. And so because of, in this situation, the decision of the young woman, there's a consequence of redemption, something beautiful. Now, sometimes people will also say, because I want to go a little bit deeper with this, they'll say, well, what if the girl's like really, really young, you know, like 10, 11 years old, when she's a victim of rape or incest? And she can't even carry the baby to term without it endangering her health. And I'm going to tell you, that situation is horrible no matter what. I'm not going to try to justify that in any way. However, it is not necessary for that young girl to have an abortion. It is actually far less traumatic on her body to have a C-section done than for her to have an abortion done. And no matter what, it's obviously a hard, difficult situation, but one decision, the baby lives. And the other, the baby doesn't, right? And then being able to trust that beauty through that child for the opportunity for redemption. I'm reading a book right now on, it's actually kind of an unusual book for a priest to read, I guess. It's by a former FBI agent who was in charge of international hostage negotiations for the United States. And he talks about his experience in dealing with people who are in these most desperate circumstances and they're making really bad decisions, right? He used one example where it was in New York City. These two guys, not the brightest bulbs in the chandelier, just decide one day they're going to rob a bank, and they end up taking hostages. And so it's just really bad, right? Now they didn't end up killing anybody, but just the amount of time it took to get them out and to resolve the situation. And he talks about how in that situation, so as he's going through it, just the consequences of the decision of these two guys who were just greedy, right? The consequence, how many different lives they would impact because of their dumb decision. They weren't thinking it through. Now, as they go through it, and this is where he talks about some of the techniques and the things that as a hostage negotiator you learn, is you help a person who's in the mode of making a bad decision to look deeper at the decision they're making. And he says you have to enter into their life, you have to enter into their mind, and you're not going to agree with them, but you enter into it. And you help them out then by assisting them to see things differently. And he says a good negotiator knows how to do that. So he writes this book actually for parents, he writes it for anybody, because he says it's so applicable to use some of these principles in our daily lives, right? And so the idea of looking deeper when we make decisions, and I don't just mean our big decisions, even our little decisions, but looking deeper, making it habitual. Every time we make a decision, we think, okay, who is this going to impact, and why am I making this decision? This morning at Mass, I was using an example of, I came across this list of, it's called the 7 subtle symptoms of pride, right? The 7 subtle symptoms of pride. And so it talks about the 7 things that you can see in our own lives of when pride is in act. And when we're using pride, there's consequences because it's going to result in sin. And so beforehand, to step back and say, I'm going to watch for these so that I don't fall into those traps. So one of them, for example, is when I'm fault finding. I'm always looking at the faults of others. And if I'm always looking at the faults of others, then I'm going to look at the world in a pretty negative way, right? I'm going to be far more likely to gossip about people. I'm not going to give them a chance. I'm definitely not going to love them if I'm always looking at their faults, right? And so the consequences beforehand of saying, okay, I need to pray through this. I need to ask Jesus to heal me so I can be more humble and be able to look at the goodness people, right? Another one was superficiality. When we just look at our world in a very superficial way, we don't go very deep. We don't look at things in a very deep way. Well, we just want to stay in our comfort zone, right? We don't want to go deeper. And so there's consequences to that. If we just stay in our comfort zone, we're going to be horrible disciples. We're not going to be missionaries, right? Okay, those are a few examples. There's consequences to that. And so how we grow in holiness, we develop virtues in our life so that we can look at our decisions with the light of Jesus Christ, with our faith, go deeper, and make good decisions so there's good consequences, right? All right, God bless and take care. I'll see you next week. 2 weeks we have Pentecost, so I'll see you next week for the ascension of the Lord. We'll celebrate the ascension. All right, God bless. Bye.